I'm James Turk. I'm a director of the Gold Money Foundation, and it's my pleasure to be here today with Rainer Münz, who's the head of research at Erste Bank here in Vienna, Austria. And Rainer is a specialist in demographics, and I want to talk a little bit about European demographics specifically and what the implications are for economic activity throughout Europe. Rainer, it's a pleasure to be chatting with you. Can you give me a little bit of background about European demographics and what we should be looking for?
First of all, the pleasure's on my side.
Thank you.
So we can clarify a few things because there are myths around demography and hard facts. And let's first look at the hard fact.
Good.
The hard facts is that we have a global population of 7 billion and 500 million of them are inside the European Union. We have a little bit more than 300 million in the US, and we have something like 135 million in Japan. So that's the developed world today. And this is the oldest part of the world, so we have the highest life expectancy. This is also the part where in certain regions the population is no longer growing but is starting to shrink. So we're talking about Central, Southeastern Europe, parts of Central Asia, in particular Siberia, but we're also talking about Japan. Mm-hmm. Now, what is the characteristics of European demographics? We have a low number of children per family, so we're talking about 1.5 children. So a family cannot have 1.5 children, but we can think of 15 children per 10 families. Then the breakdown makes sense. Yeah. Which means that the number of children in the next generation is smaller than the number of potential parents that could have children today. So our native populations on average are shrinking. We just don't see that because there is a fairly high amount of immigration from other parts of Europe and the world into the European Union, just like we have immigration into the United States, Canada, Australia, and so on. So because of high immigration, the shrinking of the domestic population is not yet felt, but it leads to a certain exchange of population. So we see an increasing ethnic, religious, and cultural diversity in our metropolitan areas, be it London, be it Paris, be it Rome, be it Berlin or Vienna, but even in places like Istanbul. The other thing is that we have the highest life expectancy ever recorded in Western and Central Europe, and this life expectancy is still increasing. So we see an aging Europe. Now, if we compare this to the world scale, we can say the 20th century has seen a quadrupling of the world's population from 1.5 billion in the year 1900 to just above 6 billion in the year 2000. This quadrupling of the world population within just a century has never happened before in history and will never happen again. So this was a unique feature of the 20th century. The 21st century is also unique. On the one hand, we still have a growing world population, which stands at 7 billion today in 2011, and which will reach maybe 9 billion in the year 2050. So that's just 39 years from now. But on the other hand, the 21st century will be marked by rapid aging. The number of people above age 65 is just 500 million people today, so just 500 million people. So we still have a fairly young world population on average, but this number of elderly citizens of our planet is going to triple over the next 40 years. So by mid-21st century, we will have 1.5 billion people in the age group 65 plus. And today, this aging is taking place in the more developed countries. We're talking about North America, Western Europe, Japan. But in the future, aging will even more so take place in places which still have a fairly young population today, because the young of today are the elderly of tomorrow. So aging in the 21st century will definitely also be an issue for places like China, like India, like Indonesia, like Brazil, and a few other emerging markets. And so they are confronted with a situation which comes much more rapidly and advances much more rapidly than in Europe. The UK, for example, had something like 150 years' time to adapt from a situation where 5% of the population were above age 65 to a situation where 25% of the population are above 65.
Which is where it is today, 25%?
Not yet, but by the year 2040, the UK and other parts of Europe will have a population where maybe 25% of the population, or maybe even a third, are in that area. In China, it's just a matter of 50 years.
Yeah.
In a few other countries, the period is even shorter. So in China, because of the one-child policy, we have rapid aging that is about to come. And as the Chinese have managed to bring down the average number of children in their families, not just to 1, but to 1.6 children per family, or let's say 10 families having 16 children altogether. That's something, so aging is just looming around the corner.
This has, let's focus on Europe first. As aging becomes more of an issue in the sense that a larger and larger percentage of the population are over 65, that obviously has an implication to government finances. Are governments addressing what is likely to be the impact on their finances from an aging population and the social programs that people are expecting?
Aging has two effects. A smaller number of children means that our expenses for family policy, but also for education, are not growing to the same extent as they would if there would still be a baby boomer generation around in our educational system. So there are savings in the younger generation, at least relative to the GDP development. And on the other hand, a larger number of elderly citizens means usually a high expenditure on pensions, on healthcare, and on a few other age-related issues, like daycare or mobile care that comes to your home. Now, I think there are two caveats. The one caveat is the pension age is not related to biology, but is related to a legal system that defines pensionable age either at a given age or in terms of years that you have contributed to a pay-as-you-go system. So this is something that can be changed. There is popular resistance to it, but the general trend in Europe is to increase actual retirement age, but also to have a higher statutory retirement age.
Which is logical as life expectation increases to have a later retirement age.
So it's kind of logical. Still yet, life expectancy usually grows more quickly than governments are able to adapt retirement age. So this favors retirement and pension systems like in Scandinavia that have a demographic factor built in, so where the adjustment is made automatically. The other caveat is that there is no functioning labor market for elderly citizens in many parts of Europe. So by just increasing retirement age without having labor market reforms, we're just shifting the problem from the pension insurance to the unemployment insurance. I think it's important also to address this. A higher retirement age where people actually really work longer and then retire later, so contribute for more years into the system and take out during a smaller period of time, is something that requires a different wage curve over a life cycle, so not so steep increases related to age or to tenure with a certain employer. It also requires a much higher training effort, because if you are 60, on average, you have left the school system some 40 to 45 years ago, and the knowledge that you acquired during your educational period usually is no longer valid, or at least part of this knowledge is no longer valid. So the question is how to bring fresh knowledge into the brains and how to bring fresh motivation into the hearts and minds of people whom we expect to work longer. So the question is about incentive structures on the one side, but it's also about keeping people productive and employable on the other hand.
As the EU has become more harmonized, has there been a movement toward labor reform or more flexibility in terms of labor, or is it still pretty much stuck in the old systems where there isn't that flexibility necessary to adjust to demographic changes?
The European Union represents a common labor market, so there is a freedom of not only establishment but also access to the 27 national labor markets, but we don't have a harmonized system when it comes to taxation, to social security, to labor laws. This is still in the realm of the 27 member states, and there's not much of a harmonization going on. We also still have 27 different pension systems in Europe.
The unions tend to be national within one country. None of them are pan-European?
The union acts as national players, but so do the employers' associations. I think that's the same. And there is very small legislation coming from Brussels into that area. The role of unions and employers when it comes to pension or to retirement systems is very small at the European level, but still very strong at national or member state level.
Is there any relationship between demographics and economic growth?
Normally you could say a larger amount of people would create more demand and could lead to growth, but it very much depends on the age structure of people. So usually when we have a declining fertility, initially declining fertility, and the number of dependent children in relation to the number of adults is decreasing, and the number of people in their productive ages is increasing. There's a so-called demographic dividend that could be reaped, which means that people have to pay less attention on time and money spent on children, and so a capital stock can be built up, and society and economy can invest more in fixed capital goods or in infrastructure.
Yeah.
Now, this is a window of opportunity that closes when this large generation of people in productive ages reaches retirement age and wants to go into pension. So the question whether a country and a society and the economy can reap the demographic dividend totally depends on the investment climate, the rule of law, also the
educational system,
and the educational system, the skills available. But China is a good example for such a transition. The Chinese one-child policy has dramatically reduced the number of births in China, and so we have now a fully productive generation of people in their 30s, 40s, and 50s who have given birth to much smaller numbers of children than their parents and grandparents. But the big question in China is, will they become rich first, or will they gray first, or become old first? And China has not yet implemented a pension system that would cover the totality of its adult population. So it's still a minority-based system, minority meaning it's aimed at middle-class people living in cities, but the people living on the countryside still are not covered by this system.
So they rely on themselves and their family rather than in Western countries where people are increasingly relying on government.
More than half the world population lives in countries where there is no universal pension or retirement system, so these people have to rely on their own ability to earn money or produce goods and services, and at the same time they have to rely on the help of their children. Extended
families in a traditional sense.
It's a traditional sense, but it can also mean in a post-traditional sense, because in countries like Indonesia or Turkey or Iran, we have seen a fairly dramatic drop in the average number of children that a family has, and many people have moved from rural areas into the big cities. So this is no longer a traditional economy and a traditional family system, but still support is expected from the children towards their parents. Whereas in North America or in Europe, we have just the opposite. Usually parents tend to help their children, even if the children are grown-ups, then the parents start taking care of grandchildren, which alleviates the situation for young parents. And usually parents tend to give money to their offspring, even if the offspring is adult and the parents are retired.
Yeah. In your work and in your research, have you had the opportunity to look at the impact of new technologies, things like nanotechnology, in terms of extending life? Is it possible that we can be thinking in 20 or 30 years' time of a person living to 120 or 130, or is that just out of the realm of possibility as far as we know it today?
Genetically, a lifespan of 120 or 130 is possible because we have a few people living on our planet who are reaching 110, 150, and 120. It's a minority, but it shows that our genes would provide us for the means to do so before we talk about genetic engineering or anything that would interfere with this natural mechanism, which could also prolong our lifespan.
Yeah, but I was referring to that age more as, not necessarily the exception, but as a general rule, like we might view 65 today.
I understand your question, but we should see first of all, today, our life expectancy increases by 6 hours a day, about 3 months a year, about 2.5 years per decade. That is at least the average over the last 150 years. So we have started in the mid-19th century with life expectancies around 30, 35. We are now in Europe at an average age of around 80, which people can reach. And the major drivers in the past have been better nutrition, so the absence of famines, the ability to fight infectious disease, so we no longer die from influenza or other contagious disease. HIV/AIDS is absolutely an outlier in this respect. And with better sanitation, so we get fresh water that is pumped into our households, and we have water treatment for the water that goes into the sewage system before it's sent back to the river and ecological systems in many parts of the world. So these are the major drivers, or have been the major drivers, of an increased life expectancy over the last 50 or 60 years. And it has first translated into a lower child, infant, and young adult mortality, meaning that paradoxically, the higher life expectancy during the first 20 years of this development has led to a younger population because of more children surviving and getting into adulthood. It's only now that the extended life expectancy is more related to an increase in the age groups 50, 60, 70, 80 plus.
Going back to the 20th century, you mentioned earlier about the growth that we saw in the population in the 20th century. And that growth occurred despite the tens of millions of people that died in warfare and persecutions and things of that nature, and of which there were many in the 20th century. Was that a big factor, actually? If that had not occurred, would there have been a significantly increase in growth? And I guess the question is really related more to the 21st century, assuming we don't see the horrors of world wars in the future. Is that likely to have a big impact on population growth, or are there other factors that are keeping people from having larger families and will keep a smaller birth rate?
The death toll of the 20th century in Europe has been horrific. We are talking about 20 million people during the First World War. We're talking about 60 million people during the Second World War, but also due to the terror regimes, both on the Nazi side and on the Stalinist side. But if we combine 60 plus 20, that's 80 million people. And in the early 1990s, the world population was growing by just 90 million people per year. So to put it in perspective, we have to see that 2 world wars plus Nazi terror plus Stalinist terror have just been the equivalent of the world population increase of the year 1990. The same is with HIV/AIDS. We have maybe 3 million people actually infected. But when you compare this with today's 78 million people who are added every year to the world population, you still see that yes, it has an impact locally. The number of people in South Africa and Botswana and Lesotho is no longer growing because of high HIV infection rates. But no, it has no, say, lasting impact on the demographic situation of Africa or of the world as a whole. What has a lasting impact is fertility, because children that are not born today will not be potential parents tomorrow, and so you have an echo effect a generation later. And I think the main driver of population change in the 21st century, besides longevity, is this much smaller fertility. So about half the population of our planet today already lives in societies which have fewer than 2 children per family. And as soon as the world average falls below 2 children, the world population will stop increasing after a certain period of time. And this is why we can predict that world population growth will definitely come to an end during the 21st century. Will stop at 9.5, maybe 10 billion people. And in the 22nd century, which seems far away, but which will start in 89 years from now, we will probably see a drop in world population.
Even with people living longer because of technological developments, simply because of the growth rate indication?
Even with people living longer, it's only if we would find a tool that would make us live forever that this effect would not take place. But I don't see that yet.
What if China, though, were to change its policy? Instead of having a one-child policy, two-child policy. That has a profound implication simply because it's such a big portion of the world population, right?
China will soon drop its one-child policy. I'm pretty sure about that, because the one-child policy has been fully effective. China has managed to avoid something like 400 to 500 million births over the last 30 years. So, at the same time, because of the strong preference for male children, there is a distortion, an imbalance between the number of young girls and the number of young boys, which further reduces the chances of children in the future, because it's the young girls that will give birth in 10, 15, 20 years from now. So we have an even more reduced number of potential mothers. And this will soon lead to a drop in the one-child policy in China. But the effect will be limited, as the future number of potential parents in China will be fairly small compared to the large numbers of potential parents that we had 20 or 30 years ago in China.
Yeah, understood. This video is going to be viewed by thousands of people around the world. Are there any parting thoughts or comments that you would like to share with the viewers of this video about demographics or anything related to that?
It's important to understand that the development of world population is also something that is related to progress. We have better living conditions. Poverty, despite the fact that the world population has quadrupled during the 20th century, has not increased. We only have 1 billion people who do not have enough to eat on a regular basis. We only have 500 million people who do not have constant access to treated or clean water. And the proportion of this population to the world population in total has not increased during the 20th century. So there is sign of progress, because we can produce a lot more food than we used to be able half a century ago. Now, the question is more about the sustainability of this green revolution, the sustainability of our lifestyle. Because on average, we are already using on our global footprint something like 2.2 hectares per head. And the surface on the world only provides 1.8 hectares per person. And for a population that would be 2 billion larger than today's, we are going down to something like 1.4 hectares per person. So we already live at the expense of the next generation. And so I think it's important to develop our lifestyle into something that is more sustainable. And so we are not preaching to forego a good life, but I think we have to look for much smarter solutions. So on the side of energy efficiency, on the side of how we feed ourselves, what kind of food we are producing. Just to give a small example.
Yeah, understood. That's why I'm very keen on the prospects of nanotechnology. It's sort of mind-boggling, some of the things that could happen, and I'm sure it will have an impact on things like food production and energy efficiency. I've been speaking with Rainer Münz, head of research at Erste Bank here in Vienna. Rainer, thank you very much for being with us. It's a real pleasure, and I appreciate you sharing this information with all of our viewers.
My pleasure, and thanks for having me.
Thank you.